Spiritual logic. I struggled with the title of this one a little bit. So this, I know I usually don't explain the videos because the title I think usually gives it away pretty clearly, but so for this one, I really am explaining my logical process when it comes to my spiritual beliefs and why that's important. We should be able to explain ourselves to others and in a way that's clearly enough for them to comprehend. Obviously, that's not always going to be the case. Some people may not necessarily be able to comprehend something due to their own bias, or maybe their schema isn't broad enough, their internal machinations and how they view the world, right? That schema. And then sometimes when you're talking to somebody, they just don't want to understand. Like I've noticed a lot of, at least that I've dealt with on the internet, not in real life, a lot of hard polytheists have a really hard time understanding a more mystical, symbolic version of theism and spirituality rather than the hard-lined understanding that comes with hard polytheism. And if you watched a video I did sometime last year, God, I don't even know how many months ago it was, about how I came to my beliefs. In that, I talked about how I noticed certain symbolic and psychological things that led me to this point. Noticing those things has led me to kind of where I'm at. And something else is, I really like defining things, being able to quantify and lay things out in a way that can be very concise. I don't know if that comes from my time in the Marine Corps or in security, or maybe a combination thereof, or maybe it's just because I'm a little OCD and kind of anal retentive when it comes to certain things. I feel like it's a really good way to be able to explain things. That's why I'll have certain ditties like, I'd rather be proven wrong than stay wrong, or, the gods are in us all, stuff like that. I feel like these little short ditties, for lack of a better term, is a way for me to convey the idea in a simple way to somebody else. I really dislike when intellectual types want to use like large words and these like just really abstract concepts to explain something, because not all of us have that background. Like I'm a working class dude. I come from a blue collar background. Dad was a biker carpenter, and his dad was a marine carpenter, and actually his dad before that was the director of corrections and also a carpenter. He was actually big on education too, though. And then on my mom's side, they're all working class too. Grandma cleaned houses. My grandpa Haldy was a painter for the state. Grandpa Boswell was cement layer. I think there's a more proper term for that. But, like I come from that blue collar background. Like I'm a fairly intelligent guy, I think, but I'm not some ivory tower egghead. You know what I mean? So for lack of a better term. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but there is a bit of a disconnect when it comes to terminology. So I like to be able to break things down in simple ways that people can understand. And I think that's very important. There's no need to make things too abstract. With that being said, first thing to mention is reductionism versus holism. So reductionism is breaking things down into their component parts. And that would be like to understand a cloud if we took a chunk of the cloud and studied that chunk, and then based on that information we can ascertain certain things about the cloud itself. Holism, on the other hand, is the opposite side of that. Holism does get a bit of a bad reputation, like holistic healing, right? That's usually some new agey like Reiki or something like that, which if you're into that stuff, that's fine, but use it with modern medicine. That's a soapbox for another day. But so holism is looking at the entirety of the thing. So that would be like studying the entire cloud, looking at it from afar. And a lot of people that dislike the idea of archetypes put down reductionism in favor of holism, right? Well, in reality, you need both. Reductionism is good. It's good to break down let's say Thor, for example, into the archetype of, okay, thunder, seeing the symbolism behind thunder and what that meant to ancient peoples. And, okay, he's a protector. Okay, that's another, type of archetype. You can take these different pieces and then look at them individually, and then you go from a holistic aspect, and then you look at the larger picture. You can compare it with things that you've reduced down into archetypal terms, like in Native American mythology, for example, the thunder bird has some similarity. Protected the people. It actually fought with the Lakota term is Uktena, which is the horned serpent. Interesting, right? Thunder serpent. You have Thor, Jormungand, kind of funny. And because of that, we can look at that in a holistic term. So we're looking at that larger. So we take these component pieces and we know what those component pieces are, and then we look at the whole of it. So using reductionism and holism, not either or, is very important, and from what I have seen, of course. And then, of course, we need to understand, because this is your path, right? So what is your center? What is the center of your belief system? Like for a lot of hard polytheists and then people that want to venerate ancestors, gods and ancestors are kind of a big one. I actually wrote an article about this. I'll put a link in the description below. Essentially, there are 3 different centers of paganism, and of course this is on a spectrum, and that's are gods and ancestors the most important thing to you, or is nature the most important thing to you? And that's something that's very popular in paganism in general, is nature worship, nature veneration. I remember back in Humboldt, when I wanted to do moots in the mall, just because it was a public place, some of the kin members didn't want to, because they felt that the gods weren't there. And of course, we all had different opinions of what that meant, but those kin members felt closest to the gods in nature. A lot of pagans are very nature-centric. And then there's self. And that's kind of where I fall, because for me, self-improvement and expanding who I am as a person is very important to me. And that's kind of been the case, and I've sort of mentioned this a little bit in previous videos, but that's kind of been the case since I was about 14, 15 years old. When I was about 14, one of my best friends got me into working out, and then I realized I didn't have to be a scrawny nerd with a little belly for the rest of my life. I realized I could do something about it. I picked up weights, and I was like, holy crap, I remember combing my hair one day, and I noticed a little bicep. It was awesome. 14-year-old me getting excited about a little bicep. And then at 15, I became more serious about martial arts, because I started studying it on my own. It took a little bit since I was about 9, about 4th grade. And I mentioned that, I think, in my Being Berserker video, but I got seriously into it when I was 15, and that was because I realized I could improve myself by seeking the knowledge. I didn't just have to sign up for classes at the local taekwondo freaking thing, which taekwondo is the McDonald's of martial arts. It's on every freaking corner, and there's chains everywhere, right?
Your weakness is disgusting to me.
Try, Mr. Simmons.
Try harder, because right now, you're sucking.
I realized that I could take that extra step. I could find knowledge and improve myself. So the self is very important for me. That being said, then there are also 3 perceptions of how you can see deity, or the spiritual realm in general. And that is mystical, figurative, and literal. Literal is exactly what it sounds like. It means believing in literal gods. That could mean, and of course this is on a spectrum, and that could mean believing in literal mythology. This is something we see with Christians, the puritanical belief that the Bible is verbatim as opposed to allegory. And then mystical, which would be more of a new agey approach. And this is kind of like and I'm going to go over this as we go along, but the idea that there's a parallel universe that mirrors our own, and this is kind of my perception, so I'm giving you my spiel, but a mystical world where the laws of physics don't really apply necessarily in the same way that it would for us, because there's nothing to say, because obviously we don't have any proof of it, other than anecdote, which we'll get into. And this would be the idea of an abstract universe of some sort. Think of it as like the astral plane, right? That's what a lot of spiritualists, the term they use, even though astral means star, but whatever. And then allegory would be more of, in its puerile sense, would be the atheopagan version, or the Jungian version of deity or spirit, meaning they are purely story, they are purely fable, they are only reflections of psychology. And if you'll recall from my video on quantum fluffy bunnies, I talked about how I categorize my logical and emotional beliefs. And on my logical side, I see the allegorical in its puerile sense. And I examine things that way. And if you watched any of my videos on gods, you can see how I do that. I break things down into archetypes, and then I kind of go over the whole, in the reductionism, holism. I go over the entirety of what that means, according to my perception and how I understand it. And then on my emotional side, I believe in a more mystical version of deity. I don't believe that it's plausible that deities exist in a more literal form. Think about like when people talk about, this deity's doing such and such in my life. Well, how are they doing that? If you believe in a literal deity, are they physically coming down and moving the chess pieces for you, or are you feeling and sensing? Notice the words there. These are emotional words. Are you feeling and sensing the gods driving you in a certain direction, or the spirits or the ancestors driving you in a certain direction? And it's really based on that observation that I believe that the gods exist in a mystical sense, not in a literal sense. So my belief is that they are both allegorical and mystical. And again, it is a spectrum. I don't think there's anybody that, well, I can't say anybody, but I think it's very rare that somebody believes that the gods are 100% literal. There is, among hard polytheists, there is the idea that the gods are independent and that they have free will, but even free will is debatable. Free will, there's a good Schopenhauer quote. I have a meme saved in my phone that I'll throw on the screen. But it's, man can do as he will, but he cannot will as he will. And the idea there is that, I have free will to decide to punch myself in the face. But what made me decide that? What in my head made me decide that? And the counter argument to free will is that everything is reactionary. Everything is some kind of data input and then a reaction to that data input. And then they also go further into the idea of ego, the idea of who you perceive yourself as, who you perceive that you are as an individual is an illusion. I believe there's actually a Buddhist concept that kind of coincides, but we are millions, if not billions of cells. I don't know, to be honest. There's definitely a crap ton of cells that make up your body, and there's a crap ton of microorganisms all over your skin, in your gut, in your hair, everywhere. And you, as a consciousness, are actually an amalgamation of all that. Honestly, I don't believe that's true, but that is one of the arguments against free will. So the idea that any being 100% has free will and knows that is highly unlikely. But that is kind of the literalist, hard polytheist argument. They believe that the gods each independently have free will. And who knows, maybe they do in the same sense that we have free will, in the same sense that I am allowed to choose based on my sensory input. But there is a most likeliness of outcome based on my personality, my past, things that have happened to me, my schema, right? So for me, a plausible understanding of what the gods are is that they are both mystical and allegorical, that they are reflections of our psychology within a parallel universe. And of course, I can't prove that. That's entirely anecdotal, based on my experience and things I've seen and my observations of both my spiritual experiences as well as the spiritual experiences that I've heard about and witnessed to a certain degree. It's kind of like the Buddhist idea of the tulpa. Like enough people believe in it and then all of a sudden it becomes real, that kind of thing. Like enough of us have a certain amount of psychic intention, I guess you could call it, and that influences the spiritual realm. And I've noticed that people kind of move in waves. You know, we tend to, like, our behavior kind of flows and ebbs, and that could be because of a mystical parallel collective unconscious, or it could simply be our instincts kind of kicking in for similar reasons. But my emotional side feels that it is mystical and parallel to this world. Which brings me to symbolism. So something else I have noticed, and this again feeds into my id perception of the spiritual. The spirit realm and religion and lore in general, and stories really as a whole, reflect symbolism, right? It's all symbolism. Like the snake I mentioned. Well, what are snakes? Okay, they can be dangerous. We have a evolutionary fear of them. Because of that, they can be very scary creatures. So like the Uktena, like I mentioned, that's the Lakota myth. There are other tribes that see it in a more positive light as well. And you see that with European paganism, like the Druids, from my understanding, as I don't really have a historical reference here, but they venerate the snake, right? So the snake represents transformation as well, because it sheds its skin. It's a type of transformation, right? You become going from one state to the next. In fact, the Uktena is a horned serpent, and more specifically an antlered serpent. Antlers shed and are often, and this is also in European symbolism and spirituality, but antlers are seasonal. And that's actually one of the ideas behind Carnunos, the Gaelic god, being more of a seasonal deity as well, because he's got antlers, and antlers shed. So you see everything symbolic. Like, you can pick any myth and look at it, and there is symbolism there. My hammer here is symbolic. The head is titanium. Titanium is extremely strong. It is a pure metal, so there's purity there. And then the wood is actually ash. And this isn't complete. I'm actually going to do a video on completing it, but once I get around to it, I have so many unfinished projects. Ash wood is what Yggdrasil is made out of. And then one of the things I did with my hammer is, you'll notice that it has a very small head and a very long haft. And that is the opposite of Mjolnir. Mjolnir has a very large head and a very short haft, as you can see. So again, the spiritual reflects the symbolic. Everything in spirituality is symbolic of something. You can pick something out of folklore. Vampires are negated by garlic. There's an interesting rule. It was a book that I read. God, I was in high school. I believe his last name is Constantios. I'll throw the book up on the screen. And I remember in that he mentions that in folklore, like repels like. So garlic and sulfur stink, so they repel vampires, which also stink because they're corpses. Again, symbolism. So the spiritual is reflective of the artistic. What is art? Emotion. All art is expressive. It is getting something out that you had in. If it wasn't emotional, it would be completely pragmatic and dull and boring and gray. Whereas art evokes emotion. It conveys a story, right? The running horses right here on my print of the Bayeux Tapestry, that evokes something. Knights, medieval stuff, memories of these things. These anecdotes come up. The spiritual realm, from my understanding, must be a reflection of that artistic intention. And again, that's something we see in these stories and this lore.
We don't read and write poetry because it's cute. We read and write poetry because we are members of the human race. And the human race is filled with passion. And medicine, law, business, engineering, these are noble pursuits and necessary to sustain life. But poetry, beauty, romance, love, these are what we stay alive for.
Symbolism in lore and literature and movies, there's a reason these archetypes just come up. There's a reason that this spiritual symbolism is in all of these ancient stories. One of the assumptions that we always make when it comes to lore, when it comes to stories from the past, is that they're all religious. And think, like, why is that per se? Why are we assuming that all these stories are religious? How come some can't just be for entertainment? Well, that's because, one, the archaeologist assuming, but also because these archetypal motifs keep coming up. Those blueprints that we have instinctually within us constantly come up in every story. That hero's journey that Joseph Campbell defined, it's so popular because it's so universal. It varies from generation to generation. Heroes vary. What is important to us varies based on our needs and wants and cultural reflections. Like in today's modern stories, it's popular to have kind of an anti-hero that defies what we used to see heroes as like 10, 20, 30 years ago. We see a lot less of the Clint Eastwood and John McClane types and more meta characters that kind of point out like a lot of the ridiculousness of the generations past. And that's because that's a need of what we have today. That's a societal need. For me, in my spirituality, like I've mentioned, I feel the gods, right? It's an artistic, spiritual understanding of what the gods are, what spirits are, of what my ancestors mean to me. Like I lost my grandpa about a year and a half ago, and he was pretty important to me. And that memory of him and who he is still exists in here and emotionally, and I venerate that idea of him, again, from my spiritual understanding. When I give worth to him and that idea, that strengthens it within me and within the spiritual realm. And again, it's debatable whether that happens in a literal sense or if that is purely within me. I believe that it does happen in a literal sense in the spiritual, figurative, parallel universe. And I think it's important that and this is why one of the reasons I say the gods are in us all, we have the archetypes within us, right? So you have within you that warrior, that Thor, that thunderer, that protector. We all have it. It's a piece of us. How strong it is up to you. It's up to how you feed it. It's up to how you explore that idea. It's up to how you feel him, how you feel Thor, or how you feel the Thunderbird, or how you feel Perun or Indra, or Shango. There's actually an African Thor called Shango who wields an axe instead. We'll go over that when I do Thor, which is super fascinating, but I'm excited. But we feed that thunderer, that protector, and that's how we get more in touch with Thor, from my understanding again, as you feel the archetypes within you. And I've mentioned this in the previous videos on gods, but the gods themselves are holistic, right? So Thor is holistic, and then protector, thunder, those are archetypes within that god. So I believe that the gods themselves are amalgamations of multiple archetypes. Like I'm getting ready to do a Scothy video, and the breakdown of her is actually absolutely fascinating because she disseminates rather than is amalgamated. But that'll be probably my next video. We'll see. My spiritual path, I try to get in touch with my intrinsic universe. Like I did a video on Yggdrasil and the symbolism of each of the worlds and how that pertains to yourself. You know, you are Midgard, that is you, that is your ego. And then Jotunheim is, you know, the more chaotic part of yourself. Svartalfheim is your anger. Vanaheim is your passion, lust, love, but also how you understand relationships. There's a whole king and queen thing there with just Frey and Freya. And, you know, I'll put a link for the video below. It's a real quick video too. That is your intrinsic universe. Really, I came upon that by just kind of jotting it down once to my wife, just kind of discussing it, I believe over text. And then it occurred to me, I was like, wow, that actually makes a lot of sense. And then I broke it down and defined it and made a video. And I believe that spiritual realm is fed by our intentions and our emotions. That's those psychic energies. And I believe that putting out that intention and that understanding and belief strengthens, you know, within the spiritual realm, and that when you encounter other people, that kind of blends. So you all have, you know, your own intrinsic universe that's parallel, but then you also have an amalgamated, you know, collective unconscious, which, by the way, Carl Jung did not put a mystical spin on that. That's actually something that New Age people did later on. Some of my chaos magic influences are coming out, actually, which is actually kind of a big part of this. Chaos magic, if you look at it, is very psychological. It can easily be applied in a psychological sense without the mystical side. But I believe that, you know, that spiritual realm parallels us, which I've mentioned like 100 times in this video so far. I'll probably cut that out a bunch. It's connected people, connected internal universes, creating larger spiritual universes, and feeding the archetypes. And then in turn, the archetypes feed us. So when you get in touch with Thor, your Thor, you are feeding the archetypes of Thor and the god Thor. Like in Bloat, when you give worth and hail Thor, that strengthens that idea of him and strengthens the idea of him and what he means to you, to the rest of your kindred. And then you all feed that god, and in turn he feeds you. He feeds your protection aspects. He feeds your strength, that thunder within you. And if you're somebody that lacks some of those qualities, it's a good thing to look toward Thor. I knew a Thorsman in Sacramento when I lived there many moons ago that was very thin, had a lot of physical ailments. I won't get into it too much, but he lacked a lot of those physical abilities and was a Thorsman. And I realized that he sought Thor because Thor had the aspects he wanted and that he couldn't attain because of his, you know, physical state. So when we look to these archetypes, and I think this is one of the ways we find our patron deity too, by the way, we strengthen that within us, and we strive to be that thing. Like when I look to Odin as an Odinsman, I want to be, you know, the Synex, the wise man. I want to walk around with a floppy hat and a giant beard and a stick. You know, I would like to be the sage, right? That's something that has always been something I've wanted to attain ever since, you know, getting more into Eastern philosophies late in high school. In a previous video, I talked about, I called it Viking Karma, Orlog, which I don't remember if I named it in the video, but it's Orlog. It is fate, essentially. The Wagnerians have dubbed it the web of weird, which weird is actually W-Y-R-D, is more of a later Anglo-Saxon term. It is not Old Norse. Earth is actually closer because Earth is the Norn of the past, right? And Earth's well feeds Yggdrasil, the world tree. This is the elevator speech version of that video. Your actions, intentions, what you do, your praxis or orthopraxis feed Earth's well. The well feeds Yggdrasil. We are part of Yggdrasil. Yggdrasil is essentially the universe, the cosmos. And Yggdrasil feeds you as being part of it. So there's a cycle there. So it keeps going. And that's another big part of my spiritual understanding. We feed the spiritual realm. We feed Earth's well, and Earth's well feeds us. We feed the archetypes. We feed the idea of Thor. We strengthen the idea of Thor. Thor feeds those archetypal aspects of ourselves. The gods are within you, right? That kind of starts to make sense, I think. Are you picking up what I'm setting down? These are also very symbolic ideas, spiritual ideas about practical reflections. In the practical sense, I love to break things down into practicality. None of this matters, whether it's true or not. It doesn't. You feeding your aspect of Thor and what you believe he is, and that strength within yourself. Like, let's say part of your devotion to Thor is lifting weights. That makes you stronger. That makes you more Thor-like. So you strengthening that Thor aspect of yourself benefits you, regardless of the spiritual realm existing or not. The idea of the spiritual realm existing motivates us. It is a symbolic wheel of reciprocation. And that brings me to something I just need to mention. Something I think we need to acknowledge. Demons versus old gods. Like, what is a demon? What is an old god? There's hardly a difference to a certain degree. Demons are often seen as malevolent. A demon is a negative aspect within us. A demon is something we have connotated to be evil, but wasn't necessarily always evil, but because of societal implications and the changing of ownership in a certain way of what was into what is, a lot of old gods get vilified and turned into demons. We see this with Baal in Baal in the Phoenician pantheon, very vilified within the Bible, seen as a negative thing to Christians. The Romans, so not to only pick on the Christians here, but the Romans did it with the Carthaginians whenever they were pagan at the time. Whenever they defeated the Carthaginians, there was if you're unaware, Carthage was an empire in northern Africa that was competing with Rome, and actually larger than Rome in the beginning. In fact, if Rome hadn't defeated Carthage, Carthage would have been the world power. Pretty fascinating, actually. I highly suggest you Google it. We often vilify certain aspects and certain gods, and they become negative things. And it's because of our twisting of what they were. You can look at Loki, right? Loki's a huge example of people trying to vilify and demonify. I know there's another term for that, but demonize Loki when he is not entirely malevolent. Tricksters often walk the line. I mentioned that in my Loki video. Tricksters often walk the line between light and dark. It's sort of their whole get down. But he's not Satan for the Norse. He is the aspect of yourself that was mischievous and walks the line of darkness. Who's that? There you are, right there, yeah. That's really the negative and positive connotation of how we see the gods, how we see deity. Because there's power in symbolism. A very good deity for dealing with those negative aspects, the demons really, is Khonsu, the Egyptian god of the moon, and shares a lot of qualities with Mani. When I do my moon video, Khonsu is going to be a huge part of that, because there's more literature on Khonsu than there is Mani, and I think Khonsu fills in a lot of the gaps. Khonsu, one of the things he does is exorcisms, but he doesn't do it in the power of Christ compels you kind of idea. He does it in the let's sit down and talk about it kind of way. I'm kind of just going off memory, but he kind of wines and dines them to a certain degree, and then gets them to a certain point where he gets them to leave the person. The moon is also a deity of mental health and a protector of children, which is kind of interesting, and I think that's related because children are developing minds. But again, we'll go over that more when I do the video on Mani, the moon god. So the last thing I'll talk about is something I find pretty interesting. So you'll find this spiritual understanding that I have. You will find the idea of it a lot in various different mythologies. One of the most clearly defined versions of that is the jinn, which is an Arabic concept, and I believe it's a carryover from Arabic paganism, but it exists within Islam today. The world of the jinn is parallel to ours. There are jinn that are atheists, there are jinn that are Christians, there is jinn that are Muslims, pagan, everything that you and I are, everything that humanity is, except that it is a parallel universe. And jinn are beings of smokeless fire. I did talk to one person with a Phoenician background, actually, that also mentioned that there are water jinn. And then there are also evil jinn that are the shaitan, and they are led by shaitan, and that's supposed to be their Satan. But one of the things in Islam that brings about the evil jinn is dirt, grime, filth, defacing the Quran. Pictures also can do this, which is why in Islam they don't have pictures of things. They use words. That's why on like their flags and stuff you'll see writing rather than, a picture of something. It's because they believe that evil spirits can come. It's just a kind of an interesting concept because you see this in a lot of different spiritualities. So yeah, that's kind of my spiritual beliefs and spiritual understanding. I know I focus a lot on the practical, so I kind of wanted to get this video out. And I think if you examine various different mythologies and how those work, you kind of start to see the things that I'm seeing. And if you disagree, of course, leave a comment, let me know, start a conversation. I'd rather be proven wrong than stay wrong. Like, subscribe, comment, do the thing. All my links are below. And be better tomorrow than you were yesterday. We are the sum of our actions. Skull.